Imagine a woman who appeared perfectly healthy, strong, smiling, and exceptionally talented in the kitchen. Yet everywhere she traveled, death quietly followed in her wake. Mary Mallon was a cook, and by all accounts, a very gifted one. She worked for wealthy families across New York City at the turn of the 20th century, moving through the finest households in the country and preparing meals for some of the most privileged people in America. Her specialty was peach ice cream, a delicate cold dessert that was never heated, passed directly from her unwashed hands to the mouths of her employers. And everywhere she went, people died. Between 1900 and 1907, Mary worked for 8 different families across New York. 7 of those households experienced typhoid fever outbreaks. The pattern was undeniable in hindsight, but typhoid was not uncommon in that era. Furthermore, the idea that a perfectly healthy person could carry and transmit a deadly disease was still scientifically radical. Germ theory was only beginning to gain acceptance. Even among physicians, nobody suspected the cook. Nobody ever suspects the cook. The connection was finally made in 1906 when a wealthy banker named Charles Henry Warren rented a summer home in Oyster Bay, Long Island. 6 of the 11 people in that household fell ill with typhoid. The owner of the property, alarmed that the outbreak would make his home unrentable, hired a sanitary engineer named George Soper to investigate. Soper examined every possible source: the water supply, the plumbing, the shellfish, and the milk. Everything came back clean. Then he traced the household staff and found her, a tall Irish woman hired as a cook 3 weeks before the outbreak began, who had quietly left shortly after people started falling sick. Her name was Mary Mallon. Soper tracked her to a townhouse in Manhattan where she had already found new employment. He approached her calmly, explained his theory, and asked for urine and stool samples to confirm his findings. Mary responded by grabbing a carving fork and chasing him out of the kitchen. When health authorities arrived in 1907 to detain her, it required 5 police officers and a female physician. The doctor had to physically sit on top of Mary inside the ambulance to restrain her during transport. Laboratory testing confirmed what Soper had suspected. Mary Mallon's gallbladder was chronically infected with Salmonella typhi, producing the bacteria in massive quantities and shedding it constantly through her hands. She was entirely asymptomatic. She felt perfectly healthy. She looked perfectly healthy, but everything she prepared with her unwashed hands carried a death sentence for someone else. She was quarantined on North Brother Island in New York for 3 years. In 1910, health officials released her under one firm condition: she was never to work as a cook again. They helped her find work as a laundress. The pay was lower, and the work was harder. Mary had other plans. 5 years after her release, a typhoid outbreak erupted at Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan. 25 people were infected. 2 died, including nurses and new mothers recovering from childbirth. Investigators traced the outbreak to the hospital kitchen. The cook had given her name as Mary Brown. It was Mary Mallon. She was returned to North Brother Island, this time permanently. Mary spent the next 23 years in isolation on that island. A total of 26 years of her life were spent detained without ever being charged with a crime, without a trial, and without a conviction. She died there in November 1938 following a stroke. An autopsy revealed live, active typhoid bacteria still thriving in her gallbladder 3 decades after she was first identified. The confirmed count was at least 51 infections and 3 deaths. Some epidemiologists place the true number of infections above 120, accounting for cases that were never formally linked to her. And here is what makes this case different from every other tragedy. After 1907, Mary Mallon knew exactly what she was. She knew what her hands did to people. She changed her name, found a hospital kitchen, and kept cooking anyway. In 1346, during the siege of Kaffa, an army launched a biological weapon over a city wall. They did not know what biology was, nor did they need to. They just knew that the bodies made people die, and that was enough. The Mongol forces of the Golden Horde had been besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula on the northern coast of the Black Sea. For months, Kaffa was one of the most strategically valuable trading posts in the medieval world, a gateway between East and West where Silk Road commerce flowed into European markets. The Mongols wanted it badly. The Genoese defenders held firm behind their walls, and the siege dragged on with no decisive breakthrough. Then something began moving through the Mongol camp that no army, no wall, and no weapon could stop. The Black Death had been sweeping westward out of Central Asia since the early 1340s, carried silently along trade routes by infected fleas riding on the backs of black rats. By the time it reached the Mongol forces outside Kaffa, it was killing soldiers faster than any Genoese arrow could. Men were developing swollen, blackened lymph nodes in their groins, armpits, and necks. Fever consumed them within days, followed by internal bleeding. Death came shortly after, often within 72 hours of the first symptoms. The Mongol army was collapsing from within, hemorrhaging soldiers to a disease they had no framework to understand. Their commander made a decision that would alter the course of human history. Rather than retreat and allow the Genoese to claim victory, the Mongols began loading their dead onto catapults and launching the plague-ridden corpses directly over the walls of Kaffa. Contemporary accounts, most notably from the Genoese notary Gabriele de Mussi, who documented the events, describe bodies raining down into the city streets. The Mongols reportedly threw as many infected corpses as they could manage, deliberately and systematically, day after day. The goal was simple. If the Mongols were dying, the Genoese would die too. The defenders threw the bodies into the sea as fast as they could, but it was not fast enough. The disease ignited inside the walls of Kaffa with terrifying speed. The same swollen nodes, the same blackened skin, and the same violent fever began appearing among the Genoese population. People died faster than they could be buried. The city, once a symbol of Genoese commercial dominance, became a sealed chamber of death. The surviving Genoese merchants did what any rational person would do. They fled. They loaded onto ships and sailed west across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean, desperate to escape the catastrophe unfolding behind them. What they did not know, and what they could not have known, was that they were carrying the plague with them. The rats in their cargo holds carried infected fleas, and the sailors themselves were already incubating the disease. Those ships docked at Constantinople, then Messina in Sicily, then Genoa itself, and then Marseille. Each port they touched became a new ignition point. Within months, the Black Death was burning across Europe with a ferocity that no medieval society had any capacity to contain. Towns emptied and clergy died alongside peasants. Mass graves were dug, filled, and dug again. By the time the plague had burned through Europe between 1347 and 1351, an estimated 30 to 60% of the entire European population was dead. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 25 million people. Some historians believe the true number exceeded 50 million across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia combined. Entire bloodlines were erased, and villages ceased to exist. The economic, religious, and social fabric of medieval Europe was torn apart so completely that historians mark the Black Death as one of the primary catalysts for the end of the Middle Ages itself. It began with a catapult and a corpse, one commander's act of desperate, furious retaliation against a city he could not breach through conventional warfare. The Mongols at Kaffa did not invent biological warfare, but they executed it with a brutality and an accidental precision that reshaped the demographic map of the known world. No weapon deployed in any war before or since has killed a higher percentage of a targeted civilization. And the Genoese who survived the siege, the ones who boarded those ships and sailed home, thought they had escaped. They had not escaped anything. They were the delivery mechanism. Every port they entered, they signed its death warrant without knowing it. The siege of Kaffa lasted months. The pandemic it launched lasted centuries. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman began dancing in the street. She did not stop, not for hours and not for days. By the end of the first week, she had been joined by dozens of others. By the end of the month, the number had climbed to 400. People were dancing themselves to death, and the city council's solution was to hire more musicians. It began in July 1518 when a woman named Frau Trofea stepped into a narrow street in Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, and began dancing without music, without apparent reason, and without any ability to stop. She danced through the afternoon and through the night. Her feet bled, and her legs gave out beneath her, yet she kept dancing. Within days, her neighbors joined her. then strangers, then people from surrounding areas who had no connection to one another, no shared illness, no shared food or water source, and nothing in common except that they had all begun moving uncontrollably and could not stop. Contemporary physician notes, city council records, and sermons from the period all document what happened next with remarkable consistency. The afflicted were not performing, they were not celebrating. Their faces were described as contorted with exhaustion and terror. Some reportedly begged for help between convulsions of movement. Several collapsed from heart failure, stroke, and sheer physical exhaustion. The dancing was not joyful. It was a physical nightmare that the victims could not wake from. Within 1 month, the outbreak had consumed an estimated 400 residents of Strasbourg, and people were dying at a rate of roughly 15 per day at its peak. The city council convened to address the crisis. Their decision remains one of the most catastrophically misguided public health responses in recorded history. Local physicians were consulted and ruled out supernatural causes, which was a remarkably rational position for 1518. They determined the affliction was medical in nature, caused by overheated blood, and prescribed the one thing they believed would purge the condition from the body: more movement. The council's official recommendation was that the victims needed to keep dancing until the fever broke. Acting on this advice with complete institutional authority, the city council cleared 2 guild halls and the grain market to create designated dancing spaces. They constructed a wooden stage in the open air and hired professional musicians, specifically drummers and pipers, to provide continuous accompaniment. They even brought in additional dancers, paid performers whose job was to keep the afflicted moving. The logic was that stopping would be dangerous and that the cure was to accelerate the very thing that was killing people. The results were exactly as catastrophic as any rational observer today would predict. The music drew crowds, and the crowds watched. Some began moving. The spectacle created a focal point that pulled in people from across the city and from surrounding villages who had not yet been affected. Rather than containing the outbreak, the council had constructed a theater for it, a public stage with professional accompaniment that broadcast the contagion to every new arrival. The dancing plague spread faster following the council's intervention than it had during its initial outbreak. Historians and medical researchers have debated the cause of the Strasbourg dancing plague for centuries. The most widely accepted modern explanation is mass psychogenic illness, formerly known as mass hysteria, a documented phenomenon in which shared psychological stress produces real, uncontrollable physical symptoms across large groups of people. The region surrounding Strasbourg in 1518 had been devastated by famine, syphilis outbreaks, and in a series of brutal winters. The population was already operating at the extreme edge of psychological endurance. The stress found a physical outlet, and once the behavior began, the visible suffering of others triggered the same response in new witnesses. The music and the public stage the council created did not treat the condition. They amplified exactly the mechanism that was spreading it. The outbreak finally subsided in September 1518, when authorities reversed course entirely, banned the music, removed the dancers from public view, and sent the afflicted to a mountaintop shrine at Saverne to pray. Isolation and removal from the public spectacle broke the cycle. The dancing stopped almost immediately. The city council of Strasbourg in 1518 faced a crisis they had no scientific framework to understand. But the lesson their failure teaches is one that echoes across every public health disaster that followed. When authorities respond to a spreading condition by creating more visibility, more gathering, and more stimulation, they do not contain the outbreak. They become the outbreak's most efficient distributor. They hired musicians to cure a plague. The music played on, and people kept dying on the dance floor. In 541 AD, the most powerful empire on earth was on the verge of reuniting the ancient world. Emperor Justinian had spent decades reconquering lost Roman territories, rebuilding crumbling infrastructure, and centralizing a trade network so vast and efficient that grain moved from Egypt to Constantinople in a matter of weeks. That efficiency was his greatest achievement, but it was also the mechanism that delivered the deadliest pandemic the ancient world had ever recorded straight to the heart of his empire. Justinian's Byzantine Empire was the dominant economic and military force of the 6th century. Constantinople, its capital, was the most populated city in the Western world, home to an estimated 500,000 people packed into dense urban quarters and fed almost entirely by massive grain shipments arriving daily from Egypt and North Africa. The grain supply was the empire's lifeline, and Justinian had perfected it. Enormous cargo ships moved continuously along established sea routes, carrying thousands of tons of grain into the city's harbor. It was an extraordinary logistical achievement for the ancient world, but it was also a perfect biological pipeline. The grain stores of Egypt were infested with black rats. The black rat, Rattus rattus, is not native to the Mediterranean world. It had spread westward along trade routes from South and Southeast Asia over centuries. By the 6th century, it was thoroughly embedded in the grain storage infrastructure of the ancient Near East. The rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the bubonic plague. When Justinian's grain ships loaded their cargo in Egyptian ports and sailed northwest toward Constantinople, the rats came with them, nestled invisibly inside the most critical supply chain in the known world. The plague arrived at the port city of Pelusium in Egypt in 541 AD and moved with the grain shipments almost directly into the heart of the empire. It reached Constantinople in 542 AD and detonated with a ferocity that contemporary witnesses struggled to describe coherently. The historian Procopius, who was present in Constantinople during the outbreak, recorded that the city was producing 10,000 dead per day at the plague's peak. Modern historians consider this figure likely exaggerated, but confirmed through archaeological and documentary evidence that the mortality rate was catastrophic. Conservative scholarly estimates place the death toll in Constantinople alone at 200,000 people, representing nearly half the city's population. Justinian himself contracted the plague and survived, one of the few documented cases of recovery among those infected during the initial outbreak. But the empire he recovered into was unrecognizable. The military campaign to reunite the Roman world collapsed entirely. Armies that had been pushing into Italy and North Africa simply ceased to function as fighting forces. Tax revenue evaporated as the population that generated it died or fled. Agricultural production collapsed as the rural workforce was decimated. The grand infrastructure projects Justinian had championed ground to a halt for lack of labor and funding. The plague did not end with the initial outbreak. It returned in recurring waves for the next 2 centuries, striking the Byzantine world approximately every 15 to 25 years, between 541 and 750 AD. Each wave killed tens of thousands more. The cumulative death toll across the entire pandemic period is estimated by modern researchers at between 25 and 50 million people across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, representing an estimated 25 to 50% of the total population of the affected region. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. The depopulation, economic collapse, and military weakness created by the plague of Justinian left the empire permanently diminished, unable to complete its reconquest of the Western Roman world, and critically vulnerable to the Arab conquests that swept through its eastern territories in the following century. Historians increasingly argue that without the plague of Justinian, the map of the medieval world would look fundamentally different. The Islamic expansion that reshaped the Middle East and North Africa may never have succeeded against a fully intact Byzantine military. Justinian built the most sophisticated grain supply network the ancient world had ever produced. He connected his empire to every major agricultural region in the known world with breathtaking efficiency. And that network, the same one that fed his 500,000 citizens, carried infected rats from Egyptian warehouses directly into the arteries of his civilization. The ships arrived on schedule, the grain was delivered, and so was everything else hiding inside it. Regarding the tragedy of infected blood, they had the cure. They had already built a safer version, yet they made the choice to keep selling the one that killed people anyway, and they shipped it specifically to countries they believed would not ask questions. In the early 1980s, hemophiliacs lived in complete dependence on a medication called Factor VIII. Without it, the blood's ability to clot was severely compromised, meaning even a minor cut, a bruise, a dental procedure, or internal injury could trigger uncontrollable bleeding. Factor VIII was not merely helpful for these patients. It was the difference between a functional life and a death sentence from the most ordinary physical accidents. The drug was considered one of the great pharmaceutical achievements of the 20th century. It was also manufactured in a way that made catastrophic contamination not just possible, but mathematically inevitable. Factor VIII was produced by pooling blood plasma collected from thousands of individual donors and processing it into a concentrated clotting agent. A single batch required plasma from as many as 60,000 different donors. The economics of plasma collection pushed manufacturers toward the cheapest available sources. Pharmaceutical companies, including Bayer's Cutter Biological Division, paid for plasma donations. The populations most willing to sell their blood for cash were also statistically among the highest risk for blood-borne illness. Prison inmates, intravenous drug users, and men from high-risk urban communities donated regularly at paid plasma centers across the United States. Nobody fully understood what was moving silently through the blood supply yet, but the mathematics were unforgiving. In a batch drawn from 60,000 donors, a single infected individual could contaminate the entire production run. Thousands of those batches were distributed worldwide. By 1982, the Centers for Disease Control began reporting a deeply alarming pattern. Hemophiliacs, who had never engaged in any high-risk behavior, were contracting a mysterious and fatal immune deficiency. The connection to blood products was becoming impossible to ignore. By January 1983, internal documents from Cutter Biological show that company executives had reviewed and acknowledged strong internal evidence that AIDS was being transmitted through plasma-derived products. By March 1983, the CDC issued a public warning explicitly stating that blood products appeared responsible for AIDS transmission among hemophiliacs. The information was not hidden from the industry. It was sitting inside their own files. In May 1983, a competitor pharmaceutical company developed and released a heat-treated version of Factor VIII. The heating process killed the virus. A safer product now existed. Bayer's Cutter division followed in February 1984, releasing their own heat-treated version in the United States and Europe. The problem had a solution. The solution was on the shelf, and Cutter chose not to use it exclusively. Internal documents that later surfaced during litigation revealed what the company did next with its remaining inventory of the older, untreated product. Rather than destroying the contaminated stock, Cutter continued manufacturing the unheated version for months after the safer alternative was available. When a distributor in Hong Kong inquired about receiving the newer heat-treated product, Cutter representatives instructed them to exhaust existing supplies of the old version first. The company then shipped more than 100,000 vials of potentially HIV-contaminated Factor VIII to markets across Asia and Latin America, regions where regulatory oversight was limited and where patients had no framework to question what they were receiving. When physicians in Hong Kong directly asked Cutter representatives whether the Factor VIII they were receiving carried AIDS contamination risk, the company's response was documented in writing. They assured the doctors it was, quote, the same fine product we have supplied for years. That statement was entirely accurate, and that was precisely the problem. This happened within living memory, and it gets worse with every case that follows. The human cost was staggering. In Japan, nearly the entire population of hemophiliacs who contracted AIDS did so through contaminated Factor VIII. In the United Kingdom, over 1,200 hemophiliacs were infected with HIV through tainted blood products, and nearly 3,000 have since died from related causes. In the United States, an estimated 10,000 hemophiliacs contracted HIV through Factor VIII. Among them was Ryan White, a 13-year-old from Indiana whose infection and subsequent battle to attend public school became the defining human face of the AIDS crisis in America. Ryan White died in April 1990 at the age of 18, 1 month before his high school graduation. The pharmaceutical companies involved paid hundreds of millions of dollars in civil settlements across multiple countries over the following decades. Not a single executive was criminally prosecuted or served prison time for the decisions documented in those internal memos. Dr. Sidney Wolfe, a physician who spent decades investigating the pharmaceutical industry, reviewed the internal documents and stated they were the most incriminating pharmaceutical industry documents he had ever seen in his career. They knew they had the safer product. They made the calculation, and they shipped death to whoever was least positioned to refuse it. In the summer of 1854, a physician named John Snow walked into a room full of officials who controlled the fate of an entire neighborhood and told them exactly what was killing their people. He had the data, the maps, the evidence, and the answer. They listened politely, but they did nothing, and people kept dying while the argument about bad air continued. Cholera had been tearing through the Soho district of London since late August 1854 with stunning speed. Within 3 days, 127 people on or near Broad Street were dead. Within 10 days, 500 people within a single half-mile radius had died from a disease that caused such severe dehydration that victims could lose liters of fluid within hours. Adults who woke feeling healthy were dead before nightfall. The streets emptied as survivors fled, reducing the local population by 3/4 within days. Those who stayed continued dying at a rate that overwhelmed every local authority attempting to respond. The dominant medical theory of the era was miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by foul-smelling air rising from rotting organic matter and sewage. The theory had governed medical thinking for centuries and was held with near religious conviction by the establishment, including the General Board of Health. The idea that invisible particles in water could transmit disease was considered fringe thinking, professionally risky, and insufficiently supported. Bad air was the answer. It had always been the answer. John Snow did not accept it. He had been building a case against waterborne transmission since an earlier outbreak in 1849. When Broad Street ignited, Snow moved methodically through the neighborhood, interviewing residents, recording addresses, and mapping every death against its precise location. What emerged was unambiguous. Deaths clustered overwhelmingly around a single water pump on Broad Street. Households using different pumps showed dramatically lower infection rates. A brewery on the same street, whose workers drank beer instead of pump water, recorded 0 deaths. A nearby workhouse with its own private well had minimal casualties, despite being completely surrounded by the outbreak. Snow presented his findings and his now famous dot map to the Board of Guardians of St. James Parish on September 7, 1854. His conclusion was specific: remove the pump handle and the outbreak would stop. The board was skeptical, but could not openly refute his data. They removed the handle the following day. New cases dropped sharply within days, but the establishment was not finished. The official report published by the Committee for Scientific Inquiries in 1855 rejected Snow's waterborne theory entirely and reaffirmed miasma as the correct explanation. John Snow died in 1858 without ever receiving official validation of his findings. Waterborne transmission was not formally accepted until the 1860s. The 1854 outbreak killed 616 people. The broader 19th century cholera pandemics, fueled by institutional refusal to accept Snow's evidence, killed millions across 4 successive waves between 1817 and 1875. Snow had the answer. They had the power. They chose their theory over his evidence, and the water kept flowing. In the summer of 1485, a disease appeared in England that killed its victims so rapidly that physicians had no framework to process what they were witnessing. A person could wake feeling perfectly healthy, develop the first symptoms by mid-morning, and be dead before sunset. There was no gradual decline, no extended illness, and no window for intervention. And the people best positioned to escape it, the wealthy, the noble, and the powerful, became the precise mechanism by which it devoured the entire country. The disease arrived in August 1485 with the army of Henry Tudor as it marched toward Bosworth Field. Within weeks of Henry's victory, the sweating sickness had erupted in London with terrifying intensity. Victims experienced sudden, severe chills, violent headaches, and intense pain across the neck and shoulders. Within hours, profuse sweating began, accompanied by a racing heart rate, delirium, and crushing exhaustion. The entire progression from the first symptom to death occurred within 2 to 6 hours. Some contemporary accounts describe victims dying within a single hour of feeling unwell. What made it uniquely terrifying was its apparent preference for the healthy and strong. Unlike the plague, which devastated the malnourished poor with particular ferocity, the sweating sickness struck wealthy, well-fed adults in the prime of life disproportionately. Frail, elderly paupers survived, while robust men in excellent health died within hours. The disease appeared to target vitality itself, which made it psychologically catastrophic for the classes accustomed to believing their wealth afforded them protection. That same wealth became the outbreak's most efficient distribution mechanism. When the sweating sickness erupted in London, the nobility did exactly what their resources allowed. They fled. Estates were opened, horses were saddled, and the most mobile and socially connected people in England scattered in every direction, carrying the disease into rural communities and market towns across the entire country. In 1517, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey contracted it 4 times in a single year. Henry VIII, terrified of the disease, abandoned his court and moved constantly between residences during outbreaks. His movement, and the movement of his entire court following him, replicated the exact dispersal pattern that had spread the disease in 1485. In 1528, the sweating sickness crossed into continental Europe for the first and only time, spreading through Hamburg, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia within months, carried directly by English travelers and merchants. The Hamburg outbreak killed over 1,000 people within weeks of arrival. Then it vanished. The 1551 outbreak was its last recorded appearance anywhere on Earth. No confirmed case has been documented since. Modern researchers have proposed hantavirus, unknown influenza strains, and various bacterial candidates, but no definitive identification has ever been made. The sweating sickness remains medically unclassified. Its origin is unknown, and its disappearance is unexplained. The people who ran from it carried it everywhere they ran, and whatever it was, it has never been found. In early 1957, a new influenza strain emerged quietly in Guizhou province, China, and began moving. It did not produce immediate, visible mass death. It spread efficiently and faster than the world's newly forming international health infrastructure could track. By the time the right people understood what was happening, it had already circled the planet, and the real tragedy was not that the world lacked tools to respond. The tools existed, and the warning came early enough. The response was simply too slow to matter. The H2N2 strain carried genetic segments that human immune systems had no prior experience with, meaning the entire global population had essentially zero pre-existing immunity. The virus reached Hong Kong by April 1957, infecting 250,000 people within weeks. From Hong Kong, the most internationally connected port city in Asia, it moved along shipping and air travel routes with extraordinary speed, reaching Singapore, Japan, and multiple continents by May. American military personnel in the Pacific were among the first domestic cases, with outbreaks appearing at naval installations before the virus had even been formally recognized as a pandemic threat. The critical early warning came from a single scientist, Dr. Morris Hilleman, a virologist at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, read a newspaper report about the Hong Kong outbreak in April 1957 and immediately recognized it as a novel pandemic strain. He obtained samples, analyzed them within days, and contacted vaccine manufacturers urging emergency production. His warning was completely accurate. The problem was biological and logistical. Influenza vaccines in 1957 were grown in fertilized chicken eggs, a process with hard physical limits that could not be accelerated. Producing sufficient doses for a national population required months of continuous manufacturing. The first doses became available in August 1957. The pandemic's most lethal wave struck in October, precisely when schools reopened and created the dense contact environments where respiratory viruses thrive. The vaccine arrived weeks too late. Distribution was uneven, prioritization was inconsistent, and the most vulnerable populations were largely unprotected before exposure. The communication failures made everything worse. China never formally reported the outbreak through official international channels in the early months. The information that saved whatever time was saved came from a newspaper, not any coordinated surveillance system. Every week lost between the virus emerging in Guizhou and its formal international recognition was a week of unimpeded global spread through completely unaware populations. The 1957 Asian flu killed between 1 and 2 million people worldwide. In the United States alone, approximately 69,000 deaths were recorded. Pregnant women and young adults with no prior immunity to the H2N2 strain were disproportionately affected. The infrastructure to catch it existed. The scientist who identified it did everything right. The warning arrived in time to begin a response, and 1 million people still died. The flu did not outrun the world. The world was simply not yet built for the speed at which it now moved. The Spanish flu was not Spanish. Spain had nothing to do with its origins, nothing to do with its spread, and nothing to do with the catastrophic decisions that allowed it to become the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. Spain simply made the mistake of telling the truth. Every other major nation chose silence, and that silence killed more people than the virus ever could have managed alone. The pandemic most likely originated in Haskell County, Kansas, in early 1918, where a physician named Loring Minor documented an unusually severe respiratory illness and reported it to the United States Public Health Service. The report was filed, but nothing was done. In March 1918, cases exploded at Camp Funston, a military training facility housing 56,000 soldiers. The military moved those soldiers, along with the virus, across the country and then across the Atlantic to the trenches of France, where troops from dozens of nations were packed into conditions that represented a perfect biological amplifier for respiratory disease. The First World War was in its fourth year. Every major belligerent government was suppressing information to protect civilian morale and military recruitment. Reporting mass illness among troops signaled weakness to the enemy. So when soldiers began dying from a respiratory illness visibly different from seasonal influenza, governments made a deliberate, coordinated decision to say nothing. Spain was neutral. Spanish newspapers reported the outbreak honestly. When King Alfonso XIII contracted the illness in May 1918, the international press picked up the story and assumed Spain was the point of origin. The name attached permanently, misattributing history's deadliest pandemic to the one country that simply refused to lie. The second wave, arriving in autumn 1918, was catastrophically more lethal than the first. The virus had mutated inside the overcrowded field hospitals of the Western Front, evolving a tendency to kill healthy adults between 20 and 40 through cytokine storms, where the body's own immune response destroyed lung tissue faster than the virus itself. Governments were still suppressing information. In Philadelphia, the city's health director allowed a Liberty Loan parade attended by 200,000 people to proceed on September 28, 1918, despite explicit physician warnings of an active outbreak. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in the city was full. Within 2 weeks, 11,000 Philadelphians were dead. The 1918 pandemic ultimately infected 500 million people, roughly one-third of the entire global population. Estimates of the death toll range between 50 and 100 million worldwide, making it more lethal than both world wars combined. The virus did not need to be uniquely deadly to reach those numbers. It just needed the world's most powerful governments to keep lying while it spread. They kept lying, the virus kept spreading, and by the time the war ended and the censorship lifted, there was nothing left to suppress. The Spanish flu was not Spanish. It was the product of a choice, and that choice had a body count. There has never been a biological event in human history that killed a higher percentage of a targeted population. Not the Black Death, not the plague of Justinian, nor any war, famine, or natural disaster in recorded history. What happened to the indigenous peoples of the Americas following European contact represents the single greatest demographic collapse in human history. And it began not with an army, but with a virus carried silently inside one man who stepped ashore in Mexico in 1520 and rewrote the fate of an entire planet. The indigenous populations of the Americas had been isolated from Old World diseases for somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years. Europe, Asia, and Africa had spent millennia living alongside domesticated animals, generating catastrophic epidemics that repeatedly swept through their populations. The survivors passed partial immunity to their descendants. Generations of biological exposure built layers of immune memory that reduced lethality over time. The peoples of the Americas had none of that inherited experience. Their immune systems had never encountered smallpox, measles, or typhus in any form. When the Spanish expedition arrived carrying active smallpox in 1520, they introduced a pathogen into tens of millions of people who had absolutely no defense against it. Smallpox tore through the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan with a ferocity that contemporary accounts struggle to describe. Streets filled with dead faster than the living could clear them. The Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had successfully driven Spanish forces from the city just weeks earlier, died from smallpox within 80 days of taking power. The political and military leadership of an empire was being destroyed by disease at the exact moment unified resistance was most critical. When Hernan Cortés returned to lay siege to the city, he was not conquering a functioning empire. He was walking into a civilization already hollowed out from within. The disease did not stop at Tenochtitlan. It traveled ahead of European soldiers along indigenous trade routes, reaching the Inca Empire before Spanish forces physically arrived. It killed the Inca emperor Huayna Capac, triggering a civil war that fractured the empire entirely. Francisco Pizarro did not defeat a unified civilization. He conquered the wreckage of one that disease had already dismantled. Wave after wave followed. Measles, typhus, influenza, and diphtheria arrived in succession across the following century, each striking populations already devastated with no recovery period between outbreaks. Modern demographic historians estimate that between 80 and 90% of the entire pre-contact indigenous population of the Americas died. Somewhere between 50 and 65 million people were gone within a century of first contact. The Americas that exist today, their borders, their cultures, their demographics, and their entire shape, were built on land that was not conquered primarily by armies. It was emptied by a virus. One man, one infection, one shoreline, and nothing was ever the same. If these accounts of history's most devastating outbreaks have changed the way you look at the world around you, please subscribe and like the video. We are unearthing the history that they have tried to bury. Let us plant the seeds for the future. The next treasury of history will be opened soon.